Welcome to segment 4. Today we're going to be talking about plant nutrition. Cal represents a company called YieldQuest. So the majority of what you hear today will be something that I have found to be the most successful nutrient package in the entire country. And I say nutrient package because, again, don't think you can grow this crop like corn. This takes a specific nutrient package that has several different applications, and it has an application specific for every single plant every single cycle that plant goes through. It's not a matter of a one-time NPK application. It's not a matter of let's do this and hope it grows. It includes soil remediation. It includes transplant solutions. It includes a foliar mist, a foliar feeding several times during that plant's life. It includes stress reduction. It includes the possibility of needing a frost prevention. Don't think you can grow this plant based on a single or maybe 2 or 3 applications. So the funnest thing about growing the cannabis plant or the industrial hemp plant, the plant that we're growing, it is in all of my life, of every plant I've grown, it is the most sophisticated plant I've ever grown. So what you have to do, you can't just say, well, we're going to give it an application. You have to go out there a few days before the application and you have to do a tissue sample. You send it to our lab and we find out what the deficiency is. So then we're not just blindly applying a product to a plant, but specifically we've identified which plants we're growing, which strains we're growing, and we know now because we test regularly. We test we take a sample from the leaves, we test it, and we find out that it's deficient in, maybe it's deficient in some micronutrient. Maybe it's nickel, maybe it's molybdenum, maybe it's carbon or boron, maybe it's whatever it is. And then the application that's made isn't just a weekly application. It's an application that satisfies that deficiency. It gets that plant exactly the food it needs when it needs it. As that plant grows and its life cycle changes, and it's going from a teenage plant to a mature veg plant to now we're going to get it ready to turn to flower, every one of those cycles requires a different nutrient level. It's just like you. When you were a kid, you probably had a vitamin that you needed. Now that you're old, you need a whole bunch of vitamins. You guys represent a whole bunch of research that has been done to reduce the stress, to make that plant so it won't go horny. Or better yet, what if I want to reduce the stress so that plant won't create a bunch of THC? The more mature that plant gets, the higher that THC level creeps up. And as you know, our government wants to regulate and regulate and regulate. They're going to continue to make sure that there's no THC that's not in the tolerance, in the acceptable level. What do you do? What magic do you do to keep the stress level right so that plant won't create that THC?
Well, the products that we use there, what we're looking for is a balance, first of all, a balance of vegetative and root system. We want to have that balanced. We want to have a balance in that plant of all of the nutrients. Just as an example, you mentioned nickel. Just recently, the research shows that nickel is critical to the movement of the sap in that plant. And the better the circulatory system in that plant, the healthier that plant's going to be. And so if you get stress of heat or a little bit of drought potentially, or a lack of sunlight that because of storms and things like that, that plant is going to be healthy enough that it's going to be able to resist and exist healthy through those levels of stress. So the healthier the plant, the more it's resistant to insects and disease, and the better able that plant is to weather different kinds of weather-related stress.
So we talked a little bit about life cycle changes. What if my plants are in the mid-summer growing season, really looking good, and really they're going through their veg cycle with a lot of good growth. They look good. What can I do when I want to tell that plant that it's time to reproduce, to turn to flower?
But one of the critical issues is, again, a balance of the right kind of nutrients. One of the problems that we faced in the past with a lot of growers when they were told to put on certain levels of nitrogen, and the nitrogen in that plant got high enough that it wouldn't allow the uptake of phosphate, which is critical to that switch. And so, but you want to have adequate nitrogen during the vegetative state. So when it gets close to that, one of the things that we'll do is we'll put a nutrient on there that will start to pull that nitrogen out to allow for the uptake of phosphate. That's just one indication that we can have some impact on those plants to influence them. And we talk about this almost like on a human basis, but you know, that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're going to influence that plant to say, okay, now it's time for me to reproduce. And then later on in that cycle, we'll actually push that a little harder so that it's actually going into the oil, to filling up that bud with the oil. So that's part of the issue. You relieve the stress, keep the plant healthy with a adequate root system to help work that plant through levels of or periods of stress, and then get it to reproduce. And we do that with the nutrients that we add at specific times in the life cycle of that plant.
So we'll mention it again, the fact that we're growing a high-value row crop and not a fodder crop like corn. We're not growing this like corn. So what's the difference between putting a single broadcast application of NPK and a specific formulated program like YieldQuest does?
Well, a lot of the growers that we've talked to, when they discussed this or got the advice from a county agent, they were told specifically grow it like corn, and we even specifically, you better put up 130 units of nitrogen per acre. And so what happened was that nitrogen, it pushes the vegetative at the expense of the roots, okay? And you grow really big plants. And then at the end of that cycle, when you're trying to go switch to reproductive, the nitrogen's in there to the point where they can't uptake the phosphate. And so we had a lot of plants, huge plants. We had growers that had plants that were 8 to 10 feet high. Yeah.
But then when I get
and they thought that was great.
When I
This
get
is
the
a
test
great
results
crop.
on that, it's like 3% oil.
Well, one of the best tests was in eastern Wyoming, and they had a control and the test, and the control got about 8%, and there was some real weather issues with that, stresses. The control, where they applied the program, it was a 70% increase in oil, and it went to 13.6%. So we know that works in areas in Tennessee where they've added it. It's been a couple of percentage points, the difference between, say, 13 and 15. So we have multiple areas around the country where we've actually used this, and sometimes it's not even the full program. And typically in that, it's a couple of percent, like in Tennessee. Where we get the full program is where we have the best chance to get the highest level of oil. And keep in mind that that's better for the farmer, it's better for the extractor, it's better for the end product. Everybody benefits when the oil is higher. So we want to do everything we can to push that oil as high as we can, reducing the stress so that THC is below 0.3%. And we've been able to do that.
So someday someday in America we'll probably go back to using hemp for fiber. And at that point,
That's close.
we'll want to grow plants that are 10 feet tall and we'll want to have high fiber. But for those of us who grow for oil, specifically, do you have enough data? Have you, I know that you've been working not only on hemp for a year, but the science that goes behind it for several years. Specifically, other than the tests you mentioned, are there ways we can know the values there in creating a high value crop, feeding each specific plant with high value nutrient? Tell me how you take the test like you've done in Wyoming and Tennessee and Utah and can create the value you create.
The last 4 weeks is critical to get that oil content up, the last push. And that's when it's important to have the correct nutrient package on there and the plant is ready to reproduce.
Okay, so we've talked about how important it is to do it right. What happens if you do it wrong? What happens if 2 weeks before you want that plant to begin that reproductive cycle, a salesman comes along and says, you should put some nitrogen on it? What happens to that plant then?
It'll stop the increase in production of oil. It'll have a huge impact on that at the very least. The other issue is if it's not balanced and doing what you want it to do, you run a serious risk of the THC too high. I know in one state, the state university indicated that there was a 7% failure rate. In other words, 7% tested high and had to be destroyed. In another state in the West, it was 40%. 40% of the crops they were too high in THC. The wrong nutrients can push that THC to where you're going to destroy your crop.
So it sounds to me like there are a lot more ways that you can make the crop fail if you start with the wrong genetics, if you feed it incorrectly, if you stress it, if you don't harvest it correctly. And there's a few ways that you can make it successful. How do you balance the fact that we're going to start 2 generations ago with genetics, and then we're going to do everything right, we're going to do every step right in order to be successful?
Well, that comes down to how much effort you're going to put into the crop. If you're going to grow it like any other forage crop, then that's what you'll get. If you're willing to take the time and effort to walk the fields and do the tissue samples and put the right nutrients on that crop, and it's a lot more labor intensive, but the difference is potential of $1,000 an acre in one crop, or $20,000 or $30,000 potential, return in another crop. What's it worth to you as a farmer? And as we meet with farmers and analyze and help them decide whether they want to grow this crop or not, that's one of the things that I push. There's a couple of things that I push. Again, the genetics, their willingness to grow, their experience, whether they have a contract to sell a crop. But if I look at those guys and I'll say, and I have told people, don't do it. Don't grow this crop, because I want you to be successful. Sit on it a year, look at what the other guys are doing, and I'm working with a farmer right now who got his field ready to grow last year, looked around and said, you know what, I don't know enough about this. So he sat on it. This year he's gonna grow 25 acres. He's met with us several times. He is ready to go, and he's willing to do whatever it takes. He's going to pay whatever it costs. He's going to be successful.
I think that's important, that people realize that you have to be willing to make the investment. It doesn't do any good to spend a lot of money on genetics if you're not willing to put the nutrient in. It's not willing to put money into genetics and nutrient if you're not willing to farm it. If you're not willing to go out there every day and manage your crop. And if you don't have a contract at the end, for sure it doesn't do any good to buy the best genetics or to buy the best nutrient and then sit on a crop at the end of the year. So as you go out there, that would be the message I would say is be balanced. And if you are going to spend a lot of money on genetics, which you should also spend a lot of money on nutrient, and then you should be willing to spend the labor to farm. And if you do that, if you take all of those categories and you buy as best as you can, you'll have a higher rate of success.
And success in this case can be a significant return for all of that extra money and all that extra labor. It's worth it. And what's interesting that I found is that we talked a little bit about soil remediation. The soils in this country are horrible. We've depleted them, okay? And so, but when farmers look at it and they say, okay, I got to make money on a crop this year, so I got to be really careful because their margins are so thin. This crop can actually pay for soil remediation. You grow this crop for a couple of years, or when you rotate it, you're going to improve the soils using this program. Your soils are going to be better off, and so that when you rotate into another crop, you're going to have a better return on that crop.
So to some extent, I think success then has to be measured a little differently. Because we're all capitalists, because we do this because we want to make money. You have to include that in the success formula. You want it to be successful. But you can add a lot to this. You can add, and we can talk someday about the success of taking the medicinal factors of the oils. We can talk about simple things like soil remediation. At the end of the year, we have a better farm because we've taken the time and the energy to be successful farmers, not just capitalist successful farmers, but our soil is better next year. And our products are being used successfully for the purpose they're intended for. So when we measure success, we can start with capitalist successes and we can say it's a lot more successful to be more profitable, but let's not forget the other values that we can create with this product.
Well, what's the value of improved soil? You know, that's big, especially in these times when we're in environmental issues. For example, we're putting on too many nitrates, and if we can fix the soil, we don't have to do that. We're cleaning up the environment.
You have to realize that at some point, all of that nitrate that we put on the soil, it ends up somewhere. It ends up in some waterway. It ends up in somebody's drinking water. It ends up someplace. You're absolutely right. We do need to spend a little bit more effort to make the environment a better place.